Welcome back, y'all, to another episode of Hip Hop Babies.
Yes, sirski.
Y'all know what it is. Host for the most, Deadleigh. Got my boy Ray with me. Classic review time. Tupac, All Eyez On Me. Man, we brought this back up because the anniversary had just passed. The album came out in February of 1996, bro. So we are deep in this at this point. My goodness.
Yes, dude, this is before both of us were even on this planet. This is some of the essentials right here, right?
This is why they call us the hip hop babies, indeed, because I was a baby listening to this and I was, it was blowing me away, man. I don't know if I could have the same opinion on it if I didn't grow up listening to it. Yeah, I probably wouldn't have had the same perspective on this album if I had listened to it when it came out. But that's the exciting part, is that, you get to hear a perspective of somebody who knows absolutely nothing, talking about an album that, I fuck with, probably not as much as Ray messes with, but I mess with this album. I got plenty of memories growing up listening to this album. It's got tons and tons of hits on here. But the deep cuts, are also what makes this album special. So, yeah, we finna get into it from the top, I guess, right?
1996, right? This is an essential album when it comes to hip-hop, especially when it comes to West Coast hip-hop. We are from Cali, we are from the Bay Area. And I think that this album was one of those albums, especially with Death Row making the movements that they were making at the time, right? Death Row was pivotal as far as like West Coast, what you were bringing to the culture, what the culture represented, especially from our coast, right? So I think that, with people like Suge Knight, even though he's kind of fallen off, obviously, and he is stumbled upon bad times, at the time, he was on top of the world, especially when it came to hip-hop. He was representing a bunch of artists that were paving a lane for certain other people. And then with this album, he paid the bail of Tupac, which then led to an agreement that he would give him, three albums at the time. And that's how this album came. Because this album came after my favorite Tupac album. I've grown up listening to Tupac. I've heard this album and his other albums hundreds of times. Me Against the World is my personal favorite Tupac album, right? It has the good balance of conscious and it has the good balance of talking his ish. While this album, he had a chip on his shoulder. He had a lot to prove considering he was coming off that case. He was still poetic, but it was way more gangsta, especially with Death Row behind him, right? He was way more aggressive. He was way more assertive to what he was trying to talk stuff about.
He's always had that gangsta air to him, but the sides of him are more pronounced on this one because he does go in so hard on tracks like, Ambitionz Az A Ridah, To America's Most Wanted, but then he takes it a completely different way when you're talking about, your favorite album, right? And he's got ballads on here that sound like they could be on there, like Life Goes On,
Yes.
You know what I'm saying? So he shows both sides and even shows his little freaky ass side with What's Your Phone Number, Danny Boy on there, I Ain't Mad at You. He's got it all, bro. And really, I think that's one of the things that stands out the most with this album in general is that it's full of bops, it's full of slaps. Even if the content isn't always lighthearted, it's what hip-hop is about. It's about unapologetic living, exuding oneself, just being authentically who you are at all times. I share that perspective. So I feel like that's really why this album connects so well with everybody, why it's considered a classic, is just because one of, if not the best rapper to grace the game at the height of his success, telling about his story. I feel like everybody tapped in here, even like the features and stuff, right? Like people who wanted to be a part of this album. Mm-hmm. You got people from all over the game. Not necessarily like the biggest names in the game, but like people that he was messing with. Like you had the LO Immortal, people that were on his label. You had people from the East Coast he was talking about earlier before this. You had Method Man, Redman, had dudes from the Bay, Richie Rich, got Be Legit, E40. You know what I'm saying? We really got everybody on here. I mean Snoop Dogg, not to mention Nate Dogg, not to mention. I feel like everybody really, before it, became what it was, everybody kind of knew what this album was going to be. I mean, even if you were just tuning into this album for the first time, 20, 30 years later after its release, I feel like you can, from the beginning track, what kind of album it's going to be, what kind of, air that he's going to have to him when he's making this music. Would you agree?
Yeah, of course. I think Tupac at the time, he was very aware of his situation. Like I said, this is coming off the case and everything. And I think that Tupac was one of those rappers that he was able to tell a story really well. Throughout his career, he was able to do that. But I think with this album, even though it hops around a bit and it is a double album, right? I do think that Tupac was able to put everything in this moment. Because this is the last album he dropped while he was alive, technically. He did record Machiavellian stuff while he was alive, but it came out after he died, right? And it was a whole nother alter ego and everything. It was a different perspective. I think with this album, he was laying it all out there. And sometimes it's eerie to hear some of the songs on this album because he does talk about his death, his inevitable demise, right? He talks about a lot of reincarnation. We're big fans of Kendrick, right? And Kendrick delves into these topics. He obviously wears the influence on his sleeve, especially when he was younger, right? And I do think this album really is the album where you see the influence rubbing off on other people. Like I said, he had that chip on his shoulder. You know, Suge Knight paid his bill. And as we know, Suge Knight, he was repping gangs and he was doing certain things. So I think with this album, it's super gangster. I mean, you know, we're talking about Ambitionz Az A Ridah. One of the best intros of all time, in my opinion. But, you know, just talking this stuff. You know, I'm riding on people. I'm flexing. You know, I'm back. You know, people thought I was gone. And I think he was at the moment where he wasn't trusting anybody. And you could hear that throughout this album. Whether it was women, whether it was his homies, whether it was certain people. I do think that moments like All About You, which I love, that was a catchy song. I remember when I was younger hearing that song, you know, not knowing what the lyrics were talking about, of course. It was stuck in my head. And going into Skandalouz, right? He was really just jaded. He was really coming from a perspective of, I got played. You know, listening to some of his older albums, he might have felt like he made music to represent women or certain underprivileged groups, and then they turned his back on him. And that's where you start to see the misogyny and certain things pop up, especially, like I said, he was riding with gangsters and stuff. You know, we talk about hip hop and its themes and how a lot of it has evolved or changed over time. But this album feels super relevant even today with certain songs and certain moments.
Yeah, I would say that. I would say even the instrumentals still sound fresh. You know, samples are clean. The instrumentation is still like live and like has like texture to it. It's very much California music, you know, with the way that they're using the synths and using the voice box and shit, right? Even on the song Got My Mind Made Up, it could sound like it's from the East Coast, you know what I'm saying? He can rap on all of it.
Mm-hmm.
Really no limitations on this project. And even though, you know, he stole the show most of the time, when he was bringing other people on there, I felt like they had their own time to shine. And that's one of the better parts about albums that are longer. You know, this is like 2-hour album, right? Posse cuts, like one type of like checkout time, right? Like,
Oof.
Where they at the, you know, the hotel and like Tupac's giving his own thing and then Corrupt's doing his own thing, Big Sykes doing his own thing. It has enough time to breathe and it has enough time to like do a bunch of different things, and that's really where this album succeeds, is the different dynamics, the different sounds that he goes for, and he can just hit like so many different highs because it's so diverse throughout.
I think a recipe that we have lost is just featuring an artist or just, you know, a singer to do the hooks, especially when it comes to certain songs. You know, you don't gotta do all the hooks yourself. Get a singer, get someone who can vocalize certain things. And I feel like Danny Boy and some of the other artists that, you know, lend a helping hand, they add a lot. I Ain't Mad At You. That's like one of my favorite songs of all time. I do think that it was a promo single. I do think that's one of the songs that have aged well because he was keeping that in mind as far as like, oh, this is a song that's going to be played on the radio at the time. And also just what he was talking about, you know, how people do evolve. You know, he had a homie calling for prison and he's saying he's Muslim now and no more dope game and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, you know, he's still a player and he respects him even though he's changing. He's just respecting that. And he's telling his girl or other people like, you know, you got to play it for life. He talks about former lovers or certain people changing up on him. And he's like, I appreciate the time. I ain't hating. Because at the end of the day, you know, people evolve, people change. And I think that hearing that was probably like, wow, Tupac was really just wearing all his emotions and all his feelings on his sleeve, even though he was keeping it gangster. It's one of the things where, you know, I was hearing this all the time. You know, I was hearing whether it was my parents, whether it was other people playing certain songs off this or, you know, playing the deep cuts. And I do think one thing that has helped this album age well is that Tupac wasn't afraid to say how he felt. You know, it's kind of eerie sometimes, you know, going into No More Pain. Life goes on, you know, talking about how after death, whether it was his homies or certain things, life goes on. And you have to leave an imprint or you have to leave a legacy behind. But at the end of the day, no matter what, life goes on. And we've kind of seen that with Tupac. You know, Tupac is one of those artists that are held to a high standard, or he's like, oh, Tupac is one of the best rappers of all time. But as rap has aged and as we've seen other rappers come and go, we don't hear Tupac brought up as much, right? We don't hear Biggie and these people from this certain period impacting as much. We've seen other artists leave their impact and these artists influence the next generation.
It's really just like, what did you see? What did you get influenced by, right? Like, and I mean, it does live on in a way, but it doesn't live on, you know, the way that a lot of times when there's like founding fathers or like founding figures, like they're held to this certain standard. The way that hip hop moves though is like, it's a young man's game. So it's like, you're really looking for who's hot, who's new. You don't find people going back that far. And why would you? I mean, I feel like a lot of the people nowadays are just wanting to find stuff that's like new or that's like clicking, and it's not about being true to yourself as much as it's about being, you know, getting attention for things. If you want attention, you can't be like, oh yeah, I'm going back to Tupac. It doesn't work. It's like you need to do something of your own. You need to do something yourself, and you're trying to find a new iteration of something that somebody's doing that's already been influenced by Tupac. So like Kendrick, influenced by Tupac, right? Who's influenced by Kendrick? That's Tupac's legacy, right? And it just goes down the chain. And, you know, if it wasn't for him, we wouldn't have the next chapter of the game. If it wasn't for Hakeem, we wouldn't have ever got LeBron. You know what I'm saying? It's just,
yeah.
That's kind of how it goes. And you kind of have to just be a student of the game to really, like, go back and be like, yeah, like, a lot of this stuff do come from Tupac. It's hard to admit that sometimes because there's, like, ego involved. And, like, if you're a fan of an artist, oh man, there's another ego, right? It's hard to say sometimes to be like, hey, yeah, like a lot of stuff did come from Tupac. You know, you want to be like, hey, what I listen to is the best. This guy was undeniably the best for, you know, like a good 5-year stretch. And, you know, the only person that was touted up there with him was, you know, Notorious B.I.G. And he's, you know, one of the best rappers that ever come out of New York. So you got to just look at it like the eras, right? And who is dominating the eras. You can't hold too much against the youngins for not being like, hey, bro, you remember when Michael Jordan was in his prime? They don't remember, bro. They was watching YouTube highlights. You know, they wasn't there.
Of course. I do think that there's a level of like, yeah, you got to move on to what's next. There's always someone fresh, especially nowadays. You know, artists are a dime a dozen. You know, with streaming, even with the DatPiff period or SoundCloud, there was artists coming up every day that were making hits or random songs. Like, let me tap in with them. But one thing Tupac had, he wasn't afraid to represent where he was from or learn all the places he had been. He was hopping around, and I do think you can hear that and you can see that with the features like you brought up on Got My Mind Made Up, you know, getting Method Man and Redman. You know, people was saying, you know, West Coast, East Coast beef, but, you know, Tupac obviously knew these guys on the other coast are bringing their own style to the table that's really raw. But at the end of the day, he has songs like California Love, where he's really rapping Cali. That's a California anthem at this point. You know, everyone knows that song from out here. You know, the way that this is a double album, especially in the hip hop sphere, I think that's really influential because we've seen other artists do double albums and stuff. And of course, before Tupac, there was double albums, but Tupac really did this on a global scale and dominated. There's not depending on how you look at it, any filler on here. Even within the deep cuts, you know, there's some songs that are like, okay, maybe you could have did without this one. But you got to think at the time, you were selling an album. There was no streaming. The singles were the singles. And then you dropped the album all together and they had to buy the album. Even looking at it now, for a 2-hour album, I was not bored really listening to this again. Yeah, obviously I'm biased. I can probably go into this album like the back of my hand. And to hear him get vulnerable on some of these tracks, even now, is like, you know, you were really spinning something that not a lot of artists were touching on, especially on this level. He will always have a special place because of that, especially out here, right? Songs like I'd Rather Be Your N-Word, talk about I don't want nothing serious. I just want to have fun. I want to drink and chill with you all day. We hear rappers talk about that now, of course. I'd rather just chill and just have fun, hook up, whatever it is. The way he brought that depth into it, like basically like, I'm doing all this, I'm trying to make it work. But at the end of the day, bruh, seeing what you give to other people, I'd rather just be your player. I'd rather just be the person you hit up when you want to have fun. Tupac was really ahead of his time. There was not a lot of rappers doing it like he was. And still, they're not really doing it like him.
The storytelling is highlighted on, I brought up Checkout Time earlier. Shorty Want to Be a Thug, another one,
Mm-hmm.
Just talking about, certain people that he sees in the streets, and things that they do, try to move and try to be like, somebody like him, right, and get to the position that he's at. And I just think that, the way that he's able to jump those perspectives, this is like one of the, not first instances, I don't want to say, but one of the earlier, mainstream instances where, rappers are actually doing stuff like that. You want to talk about like real storytelling, like this is like a real storytelling album that like it may not be like one theme, but like a slice of life, it's just like a picture of his life.
Mm-hmm.
Like all eyes are on him, right?
All eyes on me, he felt like he had a lot to prove, and he did do that effortlessly. It felt like, people give shit to outlaws, say like, oh, those are his homies, or those are the people he was trying to put on at the time. He had them a few times on this album, but like to me, it doesn't make it really miss a step because it fit, and Tupac never let them overstay their welcome that often, at least. Like I said, that goes into the 2-hour runtime of this album. Sometimes it does feel like, okay, you could have did without that feature. When we see nowadays, rappers don't really do 3 verses on some tracks. Maybe you could have did without some of the extra verses on this album.
Yeah, it's just more about like how songs were structured back in the day. But nowadays, we don't have people making music for that reason. We have people making music to get a trend, and then you just play 40-second clip from a song at a festival, and people go fucking nuts and act like, you're like the next big thing on the stage. But really, like, the repetitiveness helps drive home for people who are actually listening. People were really fans back in the day, I feel like, and people were not as much as they were because there's so much to listen to. We're going to talk about, him being a pioneer. Yeah, it's because he's super talented, but also because he's like one of the first people to be put up on the stage like that. And it was really like back when like celebrities and like people that were getting pushed through in the music industry was like a lot harder, a lot more difficult. You had to actually like have connections, and you had to have like certain things going for you for the industry to uplift you. And like nowadays it's like you can be talentless, but as long as you have like a song, it doesn't have anything to do with authenticity. It has more about to do with like virality and like what can you do to influence a certain amount of people. And it just all comes off as fake, and it doesn't come off as real like this stuff does.
And one thing about this album is it's enjoyable. It's not an album that you gotta sit and hella think about. Like we talked about Checkout Time. I remember when I visited you out in Seattle. That was a song I was like, I gotta hear this. I don't know what it was, but it was like, I was checking out. And, obviously it's not a one-to-one situation, but it's one of those things where it's like Tupac was able to tell stories and relate with so many different people. And that's one thing that's really impressed me about this album with time. And I thank my family, my parents every day, because it's one of those things where it's like, I grew up hearing this, so it's one of those things where it's easy for me to put myself in a certain perspective and hear Tupac like really paint a picture for that time period, especially hearing them at a young age. But as I got older, they connected with me more. Certain songs hit more because there were lessons to be learned. There was a lot of feelings to be felt that I hadn't felt when I was obviously younger and I hadn't been through life. But as I went through more of life, it was like, I feel life goes on more. You're picturing me rolling more, especially considering that he passed away. Like I said, some of these songs kind of get eerie because it's like he was obviously predicting his downfall, or, he obviously didn't fear death. He obviously stood for what he stood for and wanted to stand for that, even if it meant him dying. Unfortunately, even with a few albums under his belt before he died, he left an amazing legacy behind.
It's not all, sunshines and rainbows. It's still a guy that, he's talking his shit, like you were saying, and anytime you're talking your shit and you speaking what you got to say in your mind, people are not gonna like it sometimes. Just keep that in mind. He does say some stuff that can come across nowadays, especially as misogynist or rude or whatever people feel. But listening to art from like 30 years ago, you just gotta kind of accept what it was for at the time. There's a lot of context that goes into it. Mm-hmm. He definitely has moments where it's just like, all right, bro, you had a pocket.
He might make a song called, Wonder Why They Call You Bitch, but a lot of that song is him just explaining, even though it's not right, he's just saying like, this is why. This is why. It felt like a lot of people turned his back on him, especially when it came to women. Because he made songs, Brenda's Got a Baby. Like I said, Me Against the World, he wasn't as misogynistic. I feel like he still was, but it wasn't as on the forefront as it is with certain songs on this album. Death Row, he was really repping that hardcore. It was hardcore gangster rap a lot. Like songs like Picture Me Rolling and Holla At Me and Run the Streets, you might see that as kind of like, you run in the streets and I'm going to be waiting for you. But if you listen to the song, he's talking about how like, don't be on your man's back. Give him space, let him breathe. And he'll come back to you as far as like, he's going to do his thing. He's going to be out on the streets with his homies doing what he does. He's going to come home to you and make it right. But he's talking about being a player. He's talking about being thug out in the streets and doing what he does. And he's trying to make it home and be safe. He had a bunch of hits on here that you will know, undeniable. And then he has a bunch of deep cuts on here that if you really do tap in and listen to this, you'll get something from it. I wonder where he would be at if he would have kept dropping. Let's say he would have stayed alive for a few more years. With bringing the coast together with some of his messaging and some of his themes and stuff. I wonder where he would have went with this as he kept going on. And that's why I think certain people, I don't try to give them stuff for just dropping a bunch of stuff, because it's like, you got to drop while you can, because you never know. You might lose that ability to make the music you want to make. So, and he's one of those artists that really put that into perspective for me.
Music comes to you as time goes on, so he might not have even had nothing like that, you know what I'm saying? But if he did have it, the time, it could have potentially, right? And it's nowadays just hip-hop. This is a completely different age than when Tupac was releasing music, but it's gotten so commercialized that consumers feel like they're entitled to certain levels of production from artists, and if artists are dropping too frequently or if they're not dropping frequently enough, people feel a type of way about it. You see people on the internet, bombarding rappers' comments, telling them, man, you really just don't know, when you are not going to be able to do this shit no more. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, definitely drop when you want to drop. Do what you want to do, because you never know when your last project going to be. A lot of this stuff gets glorified. A lot of the stuff on this project in particular, Gangsta the Thug imagery, a lot of it gets glorified, man. And a lot of it, still prevalent for today, and even on a more over-the-top, overt degree with some of these rappers who just catching bodies so that they can feel like they're a real thug or something. You know what I'm saying? It's like... We really are 30 years down the line, and, it's still, like you said, relevant in a lot of ways. Some unfortunate ways, some good ways, A
lot of times you listen to Tupac's lyrics, bro. Unfortunately, it's not happy, bro. It's a lot of him talking about, oh, man, I'm going to die soon, or, man, I'm just trying to get these messages out. I'm just talking my stuff before I go. Because he knew his time was limited. If you live this life, either you're going to go to jail, or you're going to die. Obviously not everyone, but that's like something that's like a common denominator with people who talk about thug life, right? And unfortunately, like you said, we might see rappers these days glorifying it seems like, or just, talking about it just willy-nilly. But one thing that I loved about Tupac is that even if he did talk about this type of stuff, he did have that little bit of edge to him to point out, man, this ain't the right way to go. Whether you're doing this type of stuff or something, you got to be aware of, because no matter what, there's always going to be people trying to step on you to a certain degree. So obviously it's a classic. So I think we both highly recommend this. I think this is an essential listen. If you are getting into hip hop, or you are into hip hop, if you haven't listened to this album, please listen.
Top 3 on here for me. First one I got is Skandalouz. R.I.P. Nate Dogg, R.I.P. Tupac, bro. That song is just absolutely insane, and that's one of the most iconic voices in all of hip-hop, and just for Tupac to get him on this project, not once but 2 times back to back to start it off, bro, it just really really set the scene for me. Another one that I'm going to have on there, I'm going to have Holla At Me on there. We're talking about a lot about how he's not trusting. He's just moving through his life how he has to. It's no worries, if you got to do your own thing, you got to move how you move in this industry. You see me, holla at me, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then lastly, I'm going to put Ain't Hard to Find, The Closer, Be Legit, Sibo, E40, Richie Rich on that one. I just felt like that was hella dope, getting the Bay track going.
Mm-hmm.
He's always had the Bay influence, to recognize those guys at that time. Him putting on for the Bay right there. That was a moment. I'm going to let you give your 3.
For my first track, I got Ambitionz Az A Ridah. Like I said, that's one of my favorite intros of all time. Untouchable. My second one, I Ain't Mad At You. I still play that to this day, randomly, if I ever get the vibes. Number 3, Only God Can Judge Me.
Definite recommend, 100%, man. Make sure y'all go check out this album. If you haven't already, maybe go re-listen to it. We're approaching 30 years next year. All this stuff that we talk about, it's interwoven. It all references itself, comes back to itself. It's one of those kind of albums. That being said, make sure y'all make sure y'all comment, make sure y'all subscribe. Let us know if you fuck with the classic reviews. Y'all want some more classic reviews. Who would we do a classic review for? Should it be a more current contemporary artist, or should we go back even further in time? I want to know. Thank you to the listener, and thank you to Ray. Very passionate about this album, pushing us to talk about it, and I felt like it was a great discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Deadleigh, for of course hearing me out. I really wanted to talk about this just because, being from California, West Coast, we know how to talk our stuff, but we also know how to point back at the culture and make a point. I do think this album does that pretty well. To everybody listening, we appreciate you. To everybody who played a part in this album, I appreciate you as well. This album is classic. With that being said, peace.